Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're tracking the massive global stakes of the ongoing US-Iran confrontation centered right in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, for over 2 weeks now, we've seen the United States and Iran locked in what is literally the most direct military confrontation between these two nations in modern history. As we unpack the facts on the ground today, we're going to look at the staggering costs and how a seemingly localized dispute is rapidly, and I mean rapidly, rippling out across the entire Middle East. Bridges have fallen, entire cities have gone dark, and global energy markets, they are totally on edge. This is the burning war for the Strait. And to truly grasp the scale of the whole shebang, we actually need to look closely at the geography first. So let this single number sink in for a second. 30. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 30 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. To put that into perspective, you could drive across that distance in about 20 minutes on the highway. Yet nearly a fifth of the entire world's oil once passed through this exact tiny choke point every single day. That is a staggering concentration of global wealth and energy relying on just a few miles of ocean. And right now, that very water is a highly active battlefield. Section 1, the spark in the strait, the origins of this escalation. To really understand tonight's headlines, we've got to rewind a bit to the first week of July. Before this, a fragile truce between the US and Iran had uneasily held for months. Well, that completely collapsed on July 6th and 7th when 3 commercial ships were suddenly attacked right near the Strait of Hormuz. Washington immediately blamed Tehran for the incidents. And within days of those initial attacks, President Trump officially declared that fragile truce over. And, it wasn't just words. American forces swiftly began striking Iranian military assets. By mid-July, this wasn't just some single retaliatory skirmish anymore. No, it had evolved into a rolling military campaign that frankly became almost routine. Section 2. A rolling military campaign. Night after night. So as the peace completely broke down, the situation shifted into a sustained campaign. U.S. Central Command explicitly framed each of these coordinated strikes as a direct effort to, quote, degrade Iran's ability to threaten global shipping lanes. Now, in response to this heavy bombardment, Iran didn't just sit quietly. Their government effectively declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, labeling the waterway highly unsafe. And while independent verification of whether the strait is entirely closed still remains disputed today, the fear generated by that claim, that was absolutely real. It sent immediate shockwaves through global shipping and energy markets. And consider the sheer geographic scale of these American strikes. I mean, nights 7, 8, and 9 brought a fresh wave of attacks going far beyond the waterway itself. Just think about the spread of these targets across Iran. Bridges in Hormuzgan province were completely hit, physically cutting off major supply routes. A surveillance tower belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guard was destroyed right on the southeastern coast. We also heard reports of massive explosions echoing through the port towns lining the Gulf of Oman and the Strait, places like Bandar Abbas, Kej, and Bushehr. Honestly, these are names that most of the world had absolutely no reason to know until just a few weeks ago. The strikes even reached as far as the northwestern city of Tabriz. Section 3. The conflict widens. Beyond the strait. Now, as history tells us, no modern Middle East conflict ever really stays contained within its original borders, right? The ripple effect here is pretty alarming. First, missiles were launched toward the Jordanian city of Aqaba, which sits dangerously close to Israeli territory. While Jordanian air defenses intercepted several, one still landed in a remote area. Then, over in Syria, Iran's Revolutionary Guard actually claimed responsibility for an attack on a former American base at Al-Tanf, and they framed it as direct retaliation for U.S. strikes on the Iranian border town of Iran Shar. But wait, it spreads further. Just this week, a completely new stretch of ocean was pulled into the fray when Yemen's Houthi rebels, who were allied with Iran, began targeting Saudi tankers in the Red Sea. Meanwhile, Kuwait reported that Iran struck a civilian power generation and desalination plant right on its soil. And to support all these rapidly widening fronts, the U.S. has been quietly bumping up its fighter jet presence with dozens of aerial refueling aircraft arriving in Israel just in the last few days. And that U.S. movement into Israel makes this particular detail super significant. Israeli officials are watching this unfold like hawks, and they've repeatedly warned that any Iranian strike on Israeli soil will trigger an immediate response. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz stated very clearly that any response will be made, quote, without any dependence or conditions. On top of that, the Israeli military's chief of staff has echoed the exact same sentiment, making it crystal clear that Israel stands fully ready to resume full combat operations at any moment. Section 4. Calculating the cost. The financial and human toll. So, taking a step back to look at the numbers, this war is no longer cheap and it is certainly not bloodless. Let the staggering figure sink in. $37.5 billion. That's 37.5 billion with a B. That is the financial cost of this conflict so far, and that's a figure provided directly by U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. The sheer expenditure of keeping a massive rolling campaign active night after night is just climbing incredibly fast.
But, beyond the billions of dollars, there is a quiet, truly devastating human cost on all sides. Nearly 100 American service members have been injured since the fighting resumed on July 7th. Now, while most of those injuries are described as minor, the Pentagon has definitely faced criticism for being slow to disclose them. On the Iranian side, state media is reporting that casualties and injuries are rising each and every week, particularly from those strikes on bridges in Hormuzgan province. And in the background of all this, human rights monitors are quick to point out that thousands of Iranians died in anti-government protests earlier this year, which creates this incredibly tangled domestic and external crisis. Furthermore, in a tragic reminder that this war is literally being fought on commercial shipping lanes, an Indian seafarer who was reported missing after an attack on his vessel was later confirmed dead. Because of all this escalating danger, the U.S. State Department has issued a worldwide caution, urging Americans abroad to exercise increased vigilance.
Section 5. The diplomatic deadlock. No off-ramp in sight. Right now, military action continues to escalate, and honestly, there is no clear diplomatic off-ramp in sight. And it's fascinating because not everyone in Washington believes bombs alone can end this. Vice President J.D. Vance, who is the administration's lead negotiator on Iran, has openly questioned whether military force can fully solve the problem. He argues that, sure, radar systems, drones, and missile stockpiles can be degraded, but the Strait of Hormuz is simply too narrow and, frankly, too exposed for firepower alone to secure it. At some point, he says, someone has to sit down and talk. Former U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, a total veteran of Middle East diplomacy, voiced a very similar warning, stating that bombing Iran into submission is highly unlikely to work. But contrast that internal skepticism bubbling up in Washington with Tehran's public posture. Iran's supreme leader has continued to signal public defiance rather than any willingness to negotiate. So we're looking at a massive gap between Washington's private doubts and Tehran's entrenched stance. And right now, it shows absolutely no sign of closing.
And that leaves us right here, facing this final, absolutely critical question. Look, wars over waterways are definitely not a new phenomenon, right? Empires have literally risen and fallen over narrower straits than this one. But rarely is so much of the modern world's energy, trade, and military attention converge on 30 kilometers of water all at once. As of today, there is no ceasefire on the table. There is no summit scheduled. Just new American strikes, new Iranian claims of retaliation, and a rapidly widening web of fronts. Two governments are essentially betting that the other is going to blink first. So whether history remembers this as the moment the Middle East tipped into a devastating wider war, or the moment cooler heads finally prevailed, well, that's a story that's still being written night by night, strike by strike. We're going to keep analyzing the facts as they unfold, but for now, that is the explainer on the burning war for the Strait.